our featured speaker for this evening. And he needs no introduction, but still I have to do my job. Otherwise, I won't get any dessert today, I'm told. So let me start by trying to say his name, which is a tongue twister, and I know that he will give me less marks if I don't pronounce it. In fact, there will be a quiz later on, and you will have to say his name. And if you don't do well, no dinner for you tonight. Well, it's a pleasure for me to welcome Professor Nkonko Kamwangamalu, right? I got it. Yeah, if I read it, I'm okay. So Professor Nkonko Kamwangamalu. I've known him for a long time from the University of Illinois, where he worked under Professor Braj Kachru. But still, I have to go through the motion, right? He is a full professor of English and linguistics and a distinguished research professor and past director of graduate studies in the Department of English at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he studied under his mentor, the late Professor Braj B. Kachru, our professor also. Prior to joining Howard University, Dr. Kamwangamalu taught linguistics at the National University of Singapore, the University of Swaziland, and the University of Natal in Durban, South Africa. His research interests include code switching, multilingualism, language policy and planning, world Englishes, of course, language economics, and African linguistics. He has published widely in most of these and related areas. His latest publication is on language policy and economics, the language question in Africa, Palgrave 2016. He has over 100 articles, and if I start mentioning those, the time will be over and he won't get to speak, which won't be a very nice thing to do. So today, Professor Kamwangamalu will be speaking on the reproducing the dominance of English through EMI, English medium instruction, in post-apartheid South Africa. A very interesting topic, and I will invite Professor Kamwangamalu to please come and give us his wonderful speech.
Let me begin by thanking Mina for that generous introduction. I also would like to thank Shrida and the organizing committee for inviting me to give a talk at this conference. The topic of my talk is reproducing the dominance of English through English medium instruction in post-apartheid South Africa. The literature defines English medium instruction as the use of English language to teach content subjects mostly in non-Anglophone countries. Yet the issues that English medium instruction scholarship addresses, among them the development of student literacy in English, the influence of first language on English learning, translanguaging in an English medium instruction classroom, are also current in Anglophone countries such as South Africa, where English holds a unique position compared with other former British colonies in Africa and elsewhere. In South Africa, English belongs in two of Kachu's 1996 three concentric circles of English, namely the inner circle and the outer circle. English has this dual status because it is used as a native language by some. For instance, the younger generations of Indian South Africans and over 1 million whites of British origin who did not return to England when colonialism ended. And the language is used as a second language by others, for instance, a minority of the black population, older generations of Indian South Africans and whites of Dutch origin, commonly known as the Afrikaners. English arrived in South Africa a little over 2 centuries ago, when British troops invaded what was then known as the Cape of Good Hope, now Cape Town, and overthrew the Dutch, who had ruled the territory since 1652 to control the strategic Cape Sea route between Asia and Europe. With the territory now under their control, the British embarked on a policy of Anglicization, whose primary goal was to ban and replace Dutch with English in all spheres of life, including the educational system. The policy of Anglicization ended effectively in 1948 when the Afrikaners came into power and replaced it with what I call Afrikanerization. That is the use of the Afrikaans language in the conduct of the business of the state. The status of Afrikaans and English as the only two official languages in South Africa ended in 1994, when South Africa became a democracy and subsequently adopted in 1996 a multilingual language policy giving official recognition to 11 languages, including English and Afrikaans, and 9 African languages. Ever since, however, English has become more hegemonic than any other languages in the land. Although it is one of the 11 official languages, yes, although it is one of South Africa's 11 official languages, English is the sole medium of instruction at nearly all of the country's schools, including colleges and universities. Also, English is used as one of the 2 mediums of instruction, together with Afrikaans, at the previously Afrikaans medium universities, which have largely become Afrikaans English medium to accommodate black students' demand for English medium education. Thus, English reigns supreme in post-apartheid South Africa, and its hegemony is felt countrywide, especially in education, to the extent that none of the other official languages can match it. In this talk, I discussed some of the factors contributing to the reproduction of the dominance of English through English medium instruction in contemporary South Africa, with the focus on the following 4 factors. 1, the legacy of apartheid language and education policies, especially the policy known as the Bantu Education Act. 2, the escape clauses in South Africa's post-apartheid language policies. And 3, the stakeholders. And finally, the student protest movements. I discussed these factors in light of theoretical developments in language policy and planning, language economics, and critical linguistics. But first, a review of the literature is in order to provide the theoretical background against which the reproduction of the dominance of English through English medium instruction in post-apartheid South Africa can be understood better. Conversations about the reproduction of the dominance of English in South Africa have their roots in the social injustice that the country's minoritized language communities have experienced since the colonial era to the present, as well as in the perennial debate around the status of African languages vis-a-vis former colonial languages, in this case, English and Afrikaans, especially in the educational system. In this domain, as in others, inherited colonial language policies which favor English and to a very limited extent Afrikaans as the medium of instruction continue to inform post-colonial language policies designed to promote extended use of minoritized languages in the country's institutions. In this regard, Hamid and Jahan, 2015, point out that conversations regarding the dominance of English are in essence about inclusion and exclusion, and relate to privilege and denial. In these conversations, former colonial languages as English and Afrikaans, for example, are what Bourdieu, 1991, calls symbolic capital. Hamid and Jahan, 2015, explained that the languages are symbolic capital in two ways. One, they can be exchanged for material prosperity and mobility, and two, they are an embodiment of material resources and social privileges that need to be invested to master those languages but are inequitably distributed in society. That inherited colonial languages, language policies persist in post-independence nations such as South Africa should not be surprising at all. This is because, as Fishman, 1996, remarks, although the lowering of one flag and the raising of another may indicate the end of colonial status, these acts do not necessarily indicate the end of imperialist privilege in neo-colonial disguise. In the same vein, London 2003 notes that colonialism is a state of mind in colonizer and colonized alike. It does not end when the colonists go home. Instead, it remains an unfinished business and a footprint, impacting as it does all aspects of a post-colonial polity's life, including the choice of the medium of instruction. Along these lines, PIAC 2011, in a study of language policy justice in Nepal, remarks that because schools reproduce the dominant ideology that puts former colonial languages such as English on a pedestal, the importance of indigenous languages in education is diminished at the local as well as national level. Bourdieu's concept of a linguistic market is in order at this juncture to explain the state of affairs PIAC 2011 is alluding to. Linguistic market refers to the fact that language use indexes social, political, and economic inequality, and that different variants of a language do not enjoy the same degree of prestige in a given place at a given time. This is because, as Bourdieu 1991 explains, in any given linguistic market, some products are valued more highly than others. A related concept is what Bourdieu calls habitus, which means that people are used to viewing some languages as unsuitable medium of instruction because they have no cachet in the broader economic context. It follows that the choices that individuals make about which language to use in a given market, in the present case, South Africa's educational system, is informed not only by the economic value with which a language is associated in the linguistic marketplace, but also by habitus. Bourdieu's approach to language practices is in agreement with development in language economics, a field of study concerned with the interplay between linguistic and economic variables. More specifically, language economics is concerned with the relevance of language as a commodity in the acquisition of which individual actors may have good reason to invest. It considers language learning as a social investment that yields benefits for the investors. Along these lines, the Costa Park and We 2016 suggests the notion of linguistic entrepreneurship. Excuse me. Drawing attention to why learners invest in learning such high-status languages as English, it is explained that learners do so to align with the moral imperative to strategically exploit language-related resources for enhancing one's worth in the world. Therefore, it is extremely important to understand the interplay between linguistic and economic variables, especially in the South African context, for this understanding sheds light on why there is so much demand for English medium instruction, but virtually no comparable demand for instruction through the medium of African languages, such as Zulu, for instance. Thus, it is not surprising that language practices in South Africa's institutions, such as the educational system, point to what Fishman 1996 has termed the unum ideal. That is, in virtually all public services, including education, there has been a drift towards unilingualism in English. The literature, including my own work, spoke to this concept of unum ideal decades ago. For example, in an article aptly entitled, When 2 + 9 = 1, English and the Politics of Language in a Multilingual Society, South Africa, Kamwangamalu 2003 argues that despite the recognition of 9 African languages, in addition to English and Afrikaans, as official languages of the state, not much has changed in South Africa's language and education practices. On the contrary, back then as now, English has taken a lion's share as the chief medium of instruction in the country's educational system. In the next sections, I will discuss some of the factors contributing to the reproduction of the dominance of English in contemporary South Africa through English medium instruction, with the focus on the factors that I alluded to earlier. The Bantu Education Act laid the foundation for the reproduction of the dominance of English that we are witnessing in contemporary post-apartheid South Africa. The goal of the Bantu Education Act was threefold. One, impose Afrikaans as the medium of instruction in black schools. Two, reduce the influence and the use of English in those schools. And three, promote use of indigenous African languages as instructional medium through grade 8. Black students resisted this policy because they perceived it as a lure to self-destruction, deliberately designed by the apartheid government to deny them access to English medium education. The apartheid government's determination to implement this policy and black people's resistance against it led to the Bloody Soweto uprising of June 16, 1976, in which several people lost their lives. It is against this background of oppression of the black population by the Afrikaners that the dominance of English through English medium instruction in South Africa needs to be understood. As I have observed elsewhere, see Kamwangamalu 1997, it is ironic that one of the most controversial policies of the apartheid era, the Bantu Education Act, had a totally opposite effect to that desired for it. On the contrary, and despite the fact that in most former British colonies, English is often viewed as an interloper imposed from outside and thus politically suspect, in South Africa, English has emerged completely untainted from its colonial history, because as a result of apartheid policies, Afrikaans has shielded from this stigma. The next factor contributing to the reproduction of the dominance of English is the escape clauses in post-apartheid South Africa language policy. The policy itself, along with its main goal to elevate the status of indigenous languages, is presented on the screen. One institution in which the state envisages elevating the status of the indigenous languages is education, as evident from the following two language-related clauses. If the two clauses are any indication, it is practically impossible for anyone to receive education through the medium of their own choosing. As a result, English medium instruction remains the norm in South African schools. Also, since the policy requires that the government use at least two official languages in the conduct of the business of the state, this is generally understood to mean that one of the two official languages must necessarily be English. Arguably concerned with the loopholes evident in the 1996 language policy, as shown in the escape clauses listed in 1 and 2, in 2022, the Ministry of Education produced a document entitled Language Policy Framework for Higher Education. Anticipating, and of course the policy, the aim of that policy amendment was to elevate the status of African languages in education in particular. Anticipating the changes to the 1996 language policies as reflected in the revised language policy framework for higher education, some South African universities such as the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the University of Cape Town, and Rhodes University, rather, for example, have created language policies aimed at promoting indigenous languages as subject or as a medium of instruction. These efforts are, of course, commendable. However, they shouldn't distract from the fact that from the fact that the reality in most cases is that not much has changed concerning the medium of instruction in South Africa. For example, in their study into language practices at South African universities, Turner and Wadsmith-Cromary 2014 found that for all of them, English remains the medium of instruction and administration at those institutions. English, I will now discuss the next factor contributing to the dominance of English in South Africa, and that is the stakeholders. Namely the elite and parents. The elite are a factor in the reproduction of the dominance of English in education because, on the one hand, they formulate policies that embrace multilingualism, yet on the other hand, their language practices favor in lingualism in English as the medium of instruction. Late in 1992 refers to such practice as the private subversion of language planning. That is the practice by policymakers of agreeing with language policy publicly, but subverting it privately. Policymakers subvert the policies by giving major indigenous languages, as the case for the 9 African languages, official status that is theoretically equal to that of English, but not allowing them and their speakers access to important domains such as the educational system, to which the elite have access. It follows that though South Africa's new language policy embraces multilingualism, the freedom of movement accompanying the dismantling of apartheid drives large numbers of African parents, African language speaking parents, to place their children in English medium schools. Lee 2022 refers to parents' position on the medium of instruction as parentocracy. That is the trend according to which parents, rather than the national government, decide on the medium of instruction through which their children must be educated. On this view, Kamwangamalu and Ashraf 2013 note pointedly that when local languages don't have importance for tertiary education, or it must be said for education in general, this reduces the motivation among students and families to learn languages other than English. Similarly, late in 1994, in his study of the medium of instruction in Ghana, points out that the payoff for educating one's child in English when 100% of official business is conducted in English are far higher than the payoffs for educating the child through the medium of an indigenous Ghanaian language. In agreement, Copeland 2013 argues, and rightly so, that the decision that people make to invest in certain languages and or leave them behind is a function of the utility with which the language is associated. Likewise, Vaillancourt 1996 noted that individuals invest in language skills for their children or themselves according to the benefits and costs associated with these investments. As the demand for English increases, the Ugandan linguist Kwesiga 1994 remarks sarcastically that the few African mothers who have knowledge of this much sought after commodity will start teaching their children English before they are born. I will now move on to the last factors contributing to the reproduction of the dominance of English in South Africa. Okay, thank you. And that is, of course, students' protest movement. The history of South Africa's language struggle between English and Afrikaans, which started back in 1795, continues to this day, as evident from recent student protest movements in South Africa, of course. The literature indicates that initially, the protest movement were a demand to remove the statue of to remove the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from the University of Cape Town campus grounds. Rhodes is a former colonist who, the man who brought British rule and with it the English language to Southern Africa. Somehow, the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movement morphed into what Dube 2017 describes as a fully fledged decolonization movement, which not only set its sight on decolonizing the UCT curricula, but also inspired similar movements at other South African universities and beyond, including Oxford University in England. The main goal of these protest movements was to decolonize South African universities by replacing Afrikaans with English as the sole medium of instruction. It is argued that Afrikaans-speaking students are given preferential treatment because they are being taught in their native language, namely Afrikaans, and that the use of Afrikaans perpetuates the cultural supremacy of the Afrikaners. It is also worth noting, however, that throughout their protests, students never made any reference whatsoever to their own indigenous languages, 9 of which are official languages, as a potential medium of instruction. Pra 2016 describes students' demand to replace Afrikaans with English as merely an act of changing one slave master for another. This is because both English and Afrikaans are relics of former colonial powers, England and Holland respectively. Therefore, Therefore, I argue that the call to replace Afrikaans with English had nothing to do with decolonizing the curricula of South African universities. Instead, the rationale for the protest movements lies, on the one hand, in the students' understandable historical dislike for Afrikaans because of its association with apartheid. And on the other hand, in the political economy of English versus Afrikaans. Theoretical frameworks such as language economics and critical theory, especially Bourdieu's concept of linguistic market, shed light into why South Africans prefer English medium instruction over instruction in any other official languages. The literature increasingly acknowledges the relationship between English and economic outcomes, because even at lower levels of competence, a little English is always associated with higher earnings. In agreement in their study into language proficiency and labor market outcomes in South Africa, Cassell and Postel 2011 rather, demonstrate that there is a large earnings premium to English language proficiency among the majority of employed South Africans, but no independent premium to being proficient in an African language. Thus, it is ironic, as Dube 2017 remarks, that the protesting students who are unhappy about the African culture being privileged, about the Afrikaans culture rather, being privileged on their campuses, appear to be averse to having the English culture dominate the university landscape in South Africa. It follows that there is more to the push for English medium education in South Africa, regardless of the factors involved, historical, such as Bantu Education Act, or modern, for instance, student protest movement. Drawing on theoretical frameworks or theoretical developments in critical theory and language economics in particular, the paper has demonstrated that factors contributing to the reproduction of the dominance of English through English medium instruction in South Africa have one thread in common. They favor English medium instruction because of the socioeconomic outcomes with which English is associated at South Africa's, on South Africa's formal labor market and beyond. The question then is where do we go from here, given all the factors that I have highlighted. In the conclusion to this paper, and in light of the noted developments in language economics, I have proposed in my work, I have proposed a market-driven approach to African languages in South Africa. If these languages are to become, like English and Afrikaans, an instrument for upward social mobility in the country's linguistic marketplace. The central assumption of this proposal is that promoting South Africa's indigenous languages in the education system is first and foremost an economic or marketing problem, in the sense that unlike English and Afrikaans, knowledge of South African languages does not provide adequate compensation on the formal labor market. Therefore, I argue that for South Africa's multilingual language policy to achieve its main goal to promote use of indigenous languages in education, those languages must, like English and Afrikaans, also be associated with economic outcomes. This entails meeting at least the following intertwined four conditions. First, any legislation aimed at promoting use of South Africa's indigenous languages in education must simultaneously go beyond mere official recognition of and create a demand for these languages in the country's formal labor market. Second, creating a demand for these languages means associating an education through the medium of these languages with economic outcomes and communicating to the receiver of language planning the benefits that such an education carries on the formal labor market. Third, once the demand is created, to promote mass literacy and empower the masses with the skills they need to access resources, African languages should be used gradually throughout the entire educational system, including primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Fourth, to ensure policy implementation, certified, that is, school-acquired knowledge of African languages should become one of the requirements for access to employment. After all, as Age 2005 observes, success in language planning is about succeeding in influencing language behavior. In the present context, this entails changing the negative attitudes that the population have since the apartheid era to the present towards using African languages as the medium of instruction in schools. These ingrained negative attitudes might change if an education through the medium of indigenous African languages were as profitable as an education through the medium of English or Afrikaans. This is because, as Fishman 1990 remarks pointedly, people, and in this case, Black South Africans, would not want to be educated in their indigenous languages if the languages have no cachet in the broader social, political, and economic context. It must be noted that promoting the, let me see if, yes, it must be noted that promoting the use of indigenous languages in education doesn't mean doing away with English medium instruction or Afrikaans medium instruction. On the contrary, the idea is to create an educational environment in which English and Afrikaans and the indigenous African languages can coexist as instructional mediums, the former two in addition to rather than at the expense of the African languages. South Africa can draw on its own history of language promotion, which turned Afrikaans from being a banned language to a language for upward social mobility. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely wonderful talk and extremely thought-provoking. I thought that your diagnosis of the situation in South Africa was deeply informed and intellectually thought-provoking. I also thought that the theorization through Bourdieu was largely the right one to follow. I certainly share your feelings about the linguistic complexity of the South Africa situation. What I suppose I want to ask you is that given the issues that you have detailed with regard to how English in particular, but also Afrikaans as colonial languages still seem somehow to come up on top always, that this coming up on top, to use Bourdieu's term, is a form of misrecognition, and that this misrecognition leads to that kind of linguistic dominance. At the same time, you're suggesting that this misrecognition can be legislated away. And that, I think, is what you're proposing, that it be legislated away. So my question is, how do you think it can be legislated away, since those who are doing the legislation are members of the elite themselves and are also, as far as they're concerned, working in a democratic society where the parentocracy and wider elites are all committed to the reproduction of the misrecognized situation? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. South Africa was the last hope for the African continent, because other countries in Africa have given up. There is no language struggle to even refer to in the rest of the continent. But unfortunately, South Africa is, I don't know if I should say inadvertently or knowingly, following the model that other African countries have followed over the years. And what we as linguists can do is put forward the proposals. Now, the irony is that, as you just pointed out, the people who can act on these proposals are the people who make policies. And my answer to your question is, probably we are proposing things that we know that ultimately will not be taken into account by policymakers. But we shouldn't be discouraged from doing our job, from analyzing the situation, making proposals, because you never know. There could become someday a leader who would pay attention to the status of African languages in education. And we have the case of Nyerere, the first president or late president of Tanzania. He imposed, this is someone who had African languages in his heart. He required that Swahili be used as the medium of communication in parliament. And Swahili really prospered during Nyerere's era. But once Nyerere passed away, the elites who took power after his death just to put Swahili in the burner and reverted to English. And as a result, in Tanzania today, Swahili doesn't have the kind of high profile that it used to have during Nyerere's reign. I hope I have addressed some of your concerns.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm next. Thank you very much. Let me say, in the interest of brevity, I second the emotion of the first person who asked a question about your paper. It's well researched, and you justified the various aspects that you try to incorporate in your arguments. My question, however, is to what extent is Bourdieu relevant in an African context when markets, in a typical sense of formal markets, are no longer available? I can give you many examples, including your own country, our country, the Congo, where 80% of the population is unemployed. What's the point of studying in a language exclusively, such as French, in elementary school, secondary school, and university? So Bourdieu does not really look at the question of how markets are created. He described what existed and what continued to be aspects of language use. But when you look at Africa themselves, that's part of the problem. How do you create a market in an environment where the politicians are interested in their own, enrichment at the detriment of the population? So that has to be looked at critically, even as we discuss this as linguists, because it's not enough to say that is what's going on. It would be tantamount to saying that's a situation, we described it, we got it. No, we have to get deeper, and that's where critical, I think, social linguistic theory comes in, evaluating what is it that we're doing. Are we being realistic in terms of what is seen, or are we simply being scholars for the purpose of being scholars? I would appreciate your comment.
Okay, thank you, Mwalimu, thank you. The question is Bourdieu relevant in the present context? Bourdieu has set a theoretical framework that allows us to look into the language practices anywhere in the world. And what he shows is that because former colonial languages continue to be put on a pedestal, you cannot expect indigenous languages to rise. And this is where his relevance comes in. I understand you and I have discussed this over and over, and I anticipated that that you would ask a question related to the language situation on the continent. But I must say that, yes, Bourdieu is relevant. Just like other theoretical frameworks that I have alluded to, for instance, language economics, all of them try to explain why is it that there is so much demand for some languages, but very little for others? Whether we like it or not, the result or the bottom line is the economic value with which the languages are associated in the linguistic marketplace. And the only way that indigenous languages, whether in Africa or in other former colonies, the only way that those languages can really at least have space or become visible is for those languages to be assigned at least some kind of economic value. If, for instance, South Africa says, if you wanted to work in KwaZulu-Natal, since Zulu is the dominant language in that region, you must show academic knowledge of this language. So in South Africa, you can't get a job if you don't have English or Afrikaans. Why don't we add African languages to those two? And this is why, in the paper that I published in 2003, I said, well, we thought South Africa would be different, yet here we are with 9 languages, or 2 languages plus 9, and we are not 2, but 1. Africans had lost, whatever cloud it had during the apartheid era, and now it's English is all over the place, and I can tell you, nothing is going to change despite the efforts that the linguists, are making. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. It's not really a question, but it's a comment. First of all, I also want to join the others in complimenting you on a very well, thoroughly researched paper. It occurs to me that many of the things that you talked about with reference to South Africa are applicable to so many other countries around the world.
Yes.
And I have a background in India, and so I can talk about that. And in particular, when you talk about each state in India, as you know, is like a country in Europe with the same population, with the same space, and so on and so forth. And so Kannada, my language, is spoken by about 60 million people. And exactly the same situations, same problems have been faced by our people, our politicians, as well as intellectuals and media specialists and so on. Every single thing that you talked about, including that parentocracy and the conflict between democracy on the one hand and the intellectuals' positions on the other to preserve the country, preserve the languages and so on and so forth. For example, there was a court decision. The parents insisted on English medium teaching and English medium education, and they went to court, and the Supreme Court ruled in India that the parents have a right to get the language to get education for their children in the language that they want. It's democracy. So the Karnataka state government was made impotent although it was committed to promoting the local language, Kannada, which has a wonderful literature. It's, as I said, it is very vibrant. It has been growing since independence. All the languages are growing, but still, they cannot compete with English because of the economic value that Bordeaux talks about and what you talked about. And so on. So until people see that there is an economic value in education through their language, no amount of legislation is going to help. And secondly, although they have been trying all kinds of education, for example, I will just mention 2 things because I don't want to give a speech, just a question. So one is they have been trying to legislate that if you want to work, if you are a federal government employee, posted to work in the state of Karnataka, you must know the language we must learn the language within 3 years and things like that. So that's number one. The other thing is, there have also been there have also been movement on the part of the parents to force people, to force the government to introduce more and more English medium classes, as a result of which the demand for Kannada medium classes has gone down so much that so many government schools have to be closed because there is nobody, no takers for it. I mean, this is not complete, but there are many cases in which this has happened. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to do some cross-national, cross-linguistic studies and to come up with some very specific recommendations and things.
Thank you, Shrida. I would like to add just one comment. And this has to do with Nigeria. Nigeria has 3 national languages: Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa, in addition to English, which is the official language. Now, legislators decided at some point, okay, maybe we should use one of the languages, in the conduct of the business of the parliament. But those same people who produce language policies stood up and said, you cannot use, and I'm talking about Yoruba speakers, because they are the one in the majority in parliament. They objected, and this is what I want to share with you. Their reason was, if you use Yoruba in the legislature, it will diminish the mental capacity of legislators. Now imagine, these are people who make laws, and this is their own language. Yeah, if they can say that about their own language, what about any other language? Okay, thank you.
I just had one last question, because I've been waiting for a minute. Sort of in continuation with what everybody else is saying, but my thinking in this was, I really appreciate everything you've said, and approaching this from a point of pedagogy and legislation is one thing, which is, always in the hands of legislators, policymakers. But there's a question of infrastructure, like linguistic infrastructure. And I'm an architect, and we are made to study. I'm an architect to study in India, and we are made to study Hindi as well, because when you interact with labor infrastructures, construction workers, you need to speak Hindi. So my question is actually more related to what you were saying about the sort of the Afrikaans situation. What sort of linguistic infrastructure exists around Afrikaans that allows it to sort of enable that kind of market space and enable those sort of material opportunities? Because there's one thing to legislate, like forcing people to study an indigenous language, but that's not going to create the linguistic market. There needs to be an infrastructure. So I'm wondering what infrastructure exists, and if it's a space for hope, infrastructure isn't something necessarily a government needs to create, right? Infrastructure, luckily, are things that you can invent as a sort of private individual as well, and maybe there's a space to as just people to do something that way. So I'm just wondering if that A made sense, and B, if you had anything to say to that.
Yeah, in South Africa, 2 languages have well-established infrastructure, and these are English and Afrikaans. And English has even acquired more structure than it did, in the past as a result of the demise of apartheid. Now, as far as African languages are concerned, there is no infrastructure in terms of their usefulness in the linguistic marketplace. And this is what needs to be created. And one way to create that infrastructure is not only pass a legislation saying, oh, you know what, Zulu is an official language. Now it has an equal status, with English. No, that's not enough, because that's just theoretical. We want something concrete, something that when parents send their children to school, they can say, oh, okay, I know if my children are educated through the medium of isiZulu, they will have access to employment. They will have access to whatever resources are available in the country. That is what is lacking for African languages. But for Afrikaans and English, of course, the infrastructure is well in place, and I don't see anything shake it. I really don't see anything prove otherwise.